The sound was the first thing to truly get under my skin. A slow, maddeningly patient plink. Plink. Plink that had started 2 days ago as a faint whisper in the wall and had now become the central rhythm of my life. It was a water torture designed for the financially insecure, a constant reminder of the thin barrier between making it and sinking. My apartment, 3A, was a testament to that thinness. The paint was peeling in the corner where the damp had bloomed into a pale, ugly map of my anxieties. The floorboard sighed under my weight. But it was mine, a small box of solitude I had carved out for myself after everything else had fallen away. My routine was a fortress built against chaos. Wake at 6. Coffee black. Work at the small desk crammed into the living room. Designing logos and websites for clients who paid late, but paid eventually. Lunch was whatever was cheapest at the corner store. Dinner was more of the same. The highlight of my day, if I was being honest with myself, was the brief, silent acknowledgement I sometimes shared with the man in 3B. Julian Vance. He was older, maybe by 20 years, with hair the color of salt and iron and a way of moving that was utterly deliberate. He never hurried. His suits were quietly expensive, the kind of clothes that didn't shout their worth but held it in the perfect cut of the fabric and the subtle gleam of a well-made shoe. We'd exchanged maybe a dozen words in the year I'd lived here. Good morning, hold the elevator? Looks like rain. Each one felt like a carefully considered gift, offered from a deep well of stillness. I knew he was wealthy. The whole building knew. He owned his apartment, a sprawling double unit to my cramped one-bedroom, and rumor had it he owned half the block. But he carried his wealth like he carried his body, with a quiet confidence that required no announcement. It was just a fact, like the solid oak of the building's front door or the inevitable rise of the sun. It was this quiet power, this self-contained steadiness, that I found myself dwelling on in the long hours after my laptop screen had gone dark. I had an email from him saved in a folder, a response to a building-wide notice about window washing. It was 3 sentences long, polite and formal. Thank you for the notification. I will ensure access is provided. Regards, J. Vance. I'd read it more times than I could count, searching for a trace of the man behind the initials, for the warmth I sometimes thought I saw in his eyes when they met mine in the hallway. The dripping was getting worse. The plink, plink, was now a steady, insistent drumming against the bottom of the bucket I'd placed under the spreading stain on the ceiling. I couldn't afford a plumber, not this month. Not with my biggest client ghosting on their final payment. I'd spent the afternoon with a wrench from a cheap toolkit, tightening every pipe I could reach under my sink, knowing it was useless. The problem was in the ceiling, in the mysterious space between my world and the one above. My frustration curdled into a familiar, hopeless ache in my chest. I felt small and capable. That evening, standing in the hallway waiting for the wheezing elevator, I must have looked as defeated as I felt. The door to 3B opened, and Julian Vance stepped out. He was dressed down, for him, in dark trousers and a soft gray cashmere sweater that made him look less like a titan of industry and more like someone's comforting father. He saw me, then his gaze drifted past me to my door, where a tiny, dark trickle of water was now making a brave escape from under the frame and onto the hallway's worn runner. He didn't frown. He didn't show any flicker of annoyance that the building's decay was creeping out of my apartment and toward his. His expression was one of calm, steady assessment. His eyes, a cool, clear gray, met mine. They held a quiet gravity that made me feel pinned in place. Having some trouble, Leo? He asked. His voice was just as I remembered from our brief exchanges, a low, warm baritone that seemed to vibrate in the air between us. The sound of my own name on his lips was a small shock. I hadn't realized he knew it. I could only nod, my throat tight with a mixture of embarrassment and something else, something I couldn't name. I felt like a child caught making a mess. A leak. I managed to say, the words sounding inadequate for the relentless percussion inside my apartment. He took a step closer, his focus entirely on me. The air around him smelled faintly of cedar and clean cotton. For how long? A couple of days. It's getting worse. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. His gaze was searching, not judging. He looked at my worn jeans, my frayed t-shirt, the tension in my shoulders. He saw it all, I was sure of it. He saw the whole story of my precarious life in that single, weighted glance. I braced myself for a lecture, for a brisk instruction to call the superintendent, for the polite dismissal of a wealthy man inconvenienced. Instead, he said, "I have a few tools. Let me take a look." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of intent, a quiet offer of help that left no room for my pride to refuse. Before I could form a protest, he had turned, unlocked his door, and disappeared inside, leaving me standing in the hallway with the echo of his calm voice and the startling, unfamiliar feeling of being seen. He returned a moment later carrying a heavy-duty metal toolbox that looked like it had seen actual, serious work. It was a stark contrast to my own plastic case of mismatched, rust-tinged implements. He walked past me to my door, waiting with a patient stillness that was more compelling than any command. I fumbled with my keys, my hands suddenly clumsy, and pushed open the door to my small, damp world. The sound of the dripping filled the silence as he stepped inside. Plink, plink, plunk. It sounded louder now, more shameful in his presence. He set the toolbox down with a solid, reassuring thud. The weight of it seemed to anchor the room, to push back against the chaos. My apartment felt impossibly small with him in it. His shoulders were broad under the soft gray sweater, and his height made my low ceilings feel even more oppressive. He didn't seem to notice. His attention was entirely on the sagging, stained plaster above the bucket. He moved with an unhurried grace, his steps sure on my creaking floors. I found myself watching his hands as he opened the toolbox. They were large, clean, with neatly trimmed nails, but they weren't the soft hands of a man who only signed checks. There were faint calluses on his palms and a sureness in his grip as he selected a heavy-duty flashlight. These were hands that knew how to build things, how to fix what was broken. "Let's see the source," he murmured, more to himself than to me. He aimed the bright beam at the ceiling, his face tilted up, his expression one of intense concentration. The light caught the silver threads in his hair, making them shine. I stood by the door, feeling useless, an observer in my own home. I should have been embarrassed by the worn-out sofa, the stack of unread library books serving as a coffee table, the general air of just scraping by. But his focus was so absolute, so impersonal, it left no room for my self-consciousness. He was a man presented with a problem, and his entire being was oriented towards solving it. I watched him work, my earlier anxiety slowly being replaced by a quiet sense of awe. He was methodical, tapping gently on the wall, listening to the resonance. He moved the bucket and laid a canvas drop cloth he'd brought from his toolbox on the floor with a crisp snap. Every action was precise, economical. There was no wasted movement, no hesitation. He explained what he was doing in his low, calm voice, not as if I were an idiot, but as if I were a collaborator. "The joists run this way," he said, tracing a line in the air. "The stain is spreading along the path of least resistance. It's not coming from directly above, necessarily. It's traveling." I just nodded, mesmerized by the quiet competence radiating from him. He had taken control of the situation so completely, so effortlessly, that I felt the tight knot of stress in my shoulders begin to loosen for the first time in days. It was an unfamiliar sensation, this ceding of a burden to someone else. I wasn't used to being helped. I wasn't used to anyone being this capable. He needed to get a better angle, to check the pipes leading into the wall behind my small kitchen sink. The space was tight, a narrow canyon between the counter and the refrigerator. I was standing in the way. "Excuse me," he said, his voice soft. As he moved past me, his arm brushed against my shoulder. It was nothing, a fleeting, incidental contact. But a jolt of warmth shot through me, sharp and startling. The fabric of his sweater was impossibly soft, and the solid muscle beneath it was unyielding. My breath hitched. For a single, suspended moment, the world narrowed to that point of contact, to the clean, subtle scent of him, to the sheer physical reality of his presence in my cramped kitchen. He didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he gave no sign. He was already crouched down, the beam of his flashlight disappearing into the dark cabinet under the sink. I stood frozen for a second, my shoulders still tingling. The touch hadn't been meaningful. It couldn't have been. It was an accident of proximity, a consequence of geometry and small spaces. But my mind replayed it, analyzed it, tried to dissect its meaning. I was reading significance into shadows, projecting my own quiet yearning onto a simple act of neighborly kindness. He was quiet for a long time, the only sounds the creak of the floorboards as he shifted his weight, and the relentless drip into the bucket. I found myself holding my breath, waiting. Finally, he backed out of the cabinet and rose to his feet, a faint line of dust on the knee of his dark trousers. He looked at me, his gray eyes clear and direct. "It's not your pipe," he said. The words hung in the air. "What do you mean?" "The leak," he explained, his voice even. "The fitting that's failed is inside the wall. But based on the layout of this building, that plumbing serves my unit. The water is coming from my apartment. Leo, the irony was so thick I could have choked on it. The source of my stress, the symbol of my inability to cope, was his. The problem wasn't mine to solve at all. It was his responsibility, yet here he was, in my apartment, on his knees, fixing it. The power dynamic, which had already felt so vast, suddenly tilted in a way I couldn't comprehend. He wasn't just helping me. He was cleaning up his own mess, a mess that had spilled over into my life. "Oh," I said, the single word feeling utterly inadequate. A flicker of something, was it wry amusement, crossed his face. "Yes. Oh, so, it seems I'm the one who should be apologizing. I'm sorry for the disruption." He looked at the stained ceiling, the bucket of water. "And for the damage, it's fine," I said quickly, a reflexive response. "It's an old building, it is," he agreed. "But that doesn't make it acceptable." He looked from the ceiling back to me, and his gaze was different now. It was less about the problem in the wall and more about the man standing in front of him. "I'll need to open the wall on my side to get to the pipe. But to ensure we get it right, I'll need to coordinate from in here as well. Would you be all right with me spending some time here tomorrow to manage the repair?" The thought of him here, in my space, for a whole day was both terrifying and exhilarating. It felt like letting a lion into a birdcage. But refusing felt impossible, churlish. He was taking responsibility, offering a solution. "Of course," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Whatever you need," he gave a small, appreciative nod. "I'll have a proper plumber meet me here in the morning. 9 o'clock, if that works for you. I'll supervise him myself." He was ensuring it was done right. But he was also shielding me from the cost, from the hassle, from the entire burden. It was an act of quiet, overwhelming protection. 9 is perfect," I said. He packed his tools away, each one clicking neatly into its designated spot. The sense of order he carried with him was a balm to my frayed nerves. At the door, he paused, his hand on the knob. He looked at me again, that steady, assessing gaze that seemed to see right through me. "Get some rest, Leo. We'll have this sorted tomorrow." He said it with such calm certainty, I almost believed him. I believed that with him in charge, things could actually be sorted. As he closed the door behind him, the apartment suddenly felt vast and empty again. The only sound the patient, insistent drip of water into a bucket, a sound that no longer felt like a threat, but like the ticking of a clock, counting down the hours until he would be back. The next morning, Julian arrived at precisely 9 o'clock, followed by a plumber who looked like he wrestled bears for a living. Julian introduced us, then took charge with his usual quiet authority. My apartment became the staging ground for the operation. More drop cloths were laid down, this time by the plumber, but Julian adjusted them, making sure every inch of my worn floor was protected. He was a general commanding a small, efficient army. He explained that the plumber would cut a small, neat hole in my wall to confirm the location, then do the main work from Julian's side to minimize the disruption for me. The entire plan was built around my comfort, my convenience. I felt a strange mix of gratitude and unease. The sheer scale of his consideration was disarming. It felt like a language I didn't speak, a form of care so profound it was almost suspect. People weren't this thoughtful without wanting something. The cynical part of my brain, the part that had been honed by years of disappointment, kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. But it never did. Julian was simply present. He stood near the wall, conferring with the plumber in low tones, pointing out schematics he'd somehow procured for the building's original plumbing. He spoke their language, a shorthand of fittings and pressure and gauges. I retreated to my small desk, pretending to work, but my focus was entirely on the man across the room. I watched the way he listened, his head tilted slightly, his entire attention on the problem at hand. I watched the way the plumber, a man who probably took orders from no one, deferred to him instantly, recognizing an innate expertise and a natural authority. Around noon, the rhythmic sounds of sawing and clanking from the other side of the wall paused. Julian came over to my desk. "They're taking a break for lunch," he said. I was about to order something. What can I get for you? Oh, no. You don't have to do that, I said immediately. I have food. I gestured vaguely toward my mostly empty refrigerator. The idea of him buying me lunch felt like another debt, another layer in our already unbalanced dynamic. He didn't argue or insist. He just held my gaze, his expression unreadable but steady. I know, he said softly, but I'm ordering anyway. And I would enjoy the company, he had reframed it. It wasn't charity, it was a shared meal. An invitation. It was expertly done, leaving my pride intact while getting his way. I felt myself yielding to the soft gravity of his will. Okay, I said, the word feeling small. A sandwich would be great. Anything, really, he nodded, a faint smile touching the corners of his mouth. It was the first real smile I'd seen from him, and it transformed his face, softening the stern lines around his eyes. All right, anything it is, we ate sitting at my small, wobbly kitchen table. He'd ordered from a gourmet deli I couldn't afford to even look at, and the sandwiches were thick with roasted turkey and avocado. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was comfortable, filled with the sounds of the city outside my window and the quiet chewing of a shared meal. He asked me about my work, and for the first time, I talked about it with someone who seemed genuinely interested. I explained the challenges of freelance design, the constant hustle for clients, the feast or famine cycle of my income. I didn't mean to reveal so much, but his quiet attention was a vacuum, pulling the words out of me. He listened without pity, without judgment. He simply nodded, absorbing the information. It takes courage to build something on your own, he said when I finished. It wasn't a compliment, it was a statement of fact. And coming from him, a man who had clearly built an empire, it landed with the weight of a benediction. It made me feel seen, not as a struggling artist, but as a fellow builder, even if my construction was small and precarious. Later, they needed to move my bookshelf to get better access to the wall. It was a heavy, cheap particle board thing, sagging under the weight of my paperbacks. The plumber moved to grab one side, but Julian waved him off. We can manage it, he said, nodding toward me. So we lifted it together. Julian took the heavier side without comment, his muscles flexing under the fabric of his shirt. Our hands were inches apart. I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. We moved in sync, a silent, coordinated effort. For a few moments, we were a team, equals in a simple, physical task. We set the bookshelf down gently against the far wall. Our shoulders brushed, a repeat of the contact from the day before. This time, I was ready for it. I let myself feel the solid warmth of his body against mine for the briefest of seconds before I stepped back. When I looked up, his eyes were on me, and there was something in them, a flicker of awareness, a question that hadn't been there before. The air thickened. Just then, the plumber called his name from the other room, and the moment was broken. Julian turned away, his focus shifting back to the task at hand, but I felt the change in the room's atmosphere linger. Something had shifted between us. The careful boundary of neighbor and helper had blurred. By late afternoon, the work was done. The plumber had patched the small hole in my wall with a neat square of drywall, promising to return the next day to plaster and paint it. The dripping had stopped. The silence in my apartment was absolute, a profound and welcome peace. After the plumber left, Julian stood in the middle of my living room, surveying the scene. He'll match the paint perfectly, he said. You won't even know it was there. Thank you, Julian, I said, and the name felt natural now. For everything. I don't know what I would have done, you would have managed, he replied, turning to face me. You seem like the type who always does, he paused, and his gaze softened. But you shouldn't have to. Not when the fault was mine. He took a small step closer, and my heart hammered against my ribs. The space between us felt charged, humming with unspoken things. He seemed about to say something more, something important, when he stopped. A look of self-correction crossed his face. He was pulling back, retreating behind his formal demeanor. I worry, he began, his voice quieter now, more hesitant than I had ever heard it, that my presence here today has been an imposition. No, I said instantly. Not at all. You fixed it. I fixed the pipe, he clarified, his eyes searching mine. But I hope I haven't been overbearing. It's a habit of mine, taking charge. I just want to ensure you're comfortable. That you don't feel, he trailed off, looking for the right word. Pressured, there it was. He was naming the power dynamic, acknowledging the wealth and age and status that separated us. He was giving me an out, a chance to re-establish the boundary he had just crossed. He was asking for consent, not for a physical touch, but for the continuation of this fragile, emerging intimacy. It was the most respectful thing anyone had ever done for me. My throat was dry. I am comfortable, I think. I am more than comfortable. I am something else entirely. I'm comfortable, Julian, I said, and my voice was a raw whisper. You haven't been overbearing. You've been kind. He seemed to absorb my answer, a visible wave of relief softening the lines of his shoulders. He gave me a small, almost shy nod. Good, he said simply. He lingered for another moment, the silence stretching, before he seemed to remember himself. Well, I should let you get back to your evening. He walked to the door, and I followed him, my mind racing. Don't go. Stay. The words were a frantic shout in my head, but I couldn't make them pass my lips. He opened the door and stepped into the hallway, turning back to face me. I'll see you tomorrow, Leo. And then he was gone, the solid click of his door shutting across the hall sealing the silence between us. I leaned my forehead against my own door, the cool wood a stark contrast to the heat in my face. The pipe was fixed. The excuse for his presence was gone, and I had never felt more broken. The silence in the apartment was a heavy blanket. For 2 days, the space had been filled with purpose, with the low murmur of conversation, with his solid, grounding presence. Now, it was just me and the four walls again. The quiet I had once cherished now felt like an absence, an emptiness that echoed with the memory of his voice. I tried to work, but the words on my screen blurred together. Every creak of the floorboards in the hallway made my head snap up, hoping. I avoided him. It was a conscious, cowardly retreat. When I heard his door open, I waited until I heard it close before I dared to venture out. I took the stairs to avoid the possibility of sharing the elevator. I felt like a fool, like a teenager with a crush, but the feelings he had stirred up in me were too new, too potent. I didn't know what to do with them. He was a wealthy, powerful man from a different world. I was a freelance designer struggling to pay rent. The chasm between us seemed impossibly wide. On the third day, Mrs. Gable from 2A caught me by the mailboxes. She was a small, bird-like woman with eyes that missed nothing. Leo, dear, she chirped, clutching a handful of catalogs. I saw you had the plumbers in. Everything all right. Just a small leak, I said, keeping my tone noncommittal. It's all fixed now. Oh, I'm so glad, she said, her gaze sharp. And so wonderful of Mr. Vance to oversee it all himself. Such a helpful man. It's so nice to see him taking an interest in things on our floor. Her words were innocent enough, but the insinuation was clear. The gossip mill was already churning. The wealthy recluse in 3B was suddenly spending time with the quiet, struggling young man in 3A. I felt a hot flush of shame and anger. Our interaction, which had felt so private and genuine, was now a public spectacle, a piece of neighborhood chatter. The encounter solidified my resolve to pull back. I needed to protect myself. Whatever this fragile thing was between me and Julian, it couldn't survive the weight of speculation, of judgment. It couldn't survive the reality of our differences. I retreated further into myself, building my walls higher than ever. That evening, there was a knock on my door. It wasn't the loud, official rap of a delivery person. It was a soft, hesitant knock. My heart leaped into my throat. I knew, with absolute certainty, who it was. I stood frozen in the middle of my living room, my mind a whirlwind of panic. If I opened it, I would be lost. If I didn't, I would regret it forever. The knock came again, a little more insistent this time. Taking a deep breath, I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. Julian stood in the hallway, his hands in the pockets of his dark trousers. He looked uncertain. It was an expression I had never seen on him before, and it did more to undo my resolve than any command would have. I opened the door. He didn't try to come in. He stood on the threshold, his presence filling the doorway. He looked tired, older than he had a few days ago. There were new lines of concern around his eyes. Leo, he said, his voice low. I'm sorry to disturb you. It's fine, I lied. What's up? The casual phrase sounded absurdly out of place. He looked down at his shoes for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. When he looked back up, his gray eyes were filled with a startling vulnerability. I haven't seen you, he said. It was a simple statement of fact, but it landed like an accusation and a plea all at once. I was worried I had overstepped. This is my chance. I can end this now. I can say, no, everything's fine, just been busy. And we can go back to being strangers who share a hallway. I can retreat to the safety of my solitude. But I look at his face, at the genuine concern etched there, and I know I can't do it. I can't lie to this man. You didn't overstep, I said, my voice barely a whisper. The admission cost me something, a piece of my carefully constructed armor. He seemed to exhale, a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Then what is it? Did I do something to offend you? I shook my head, my gaze dropping to the worn welcome mat. No, of course not. It's just, how could I explain it? The gossip, the fear, the dizzying sense of falling for someone so completely out of my league. It's complicated, help me understand, he said, his voice gentle but persistent. He wasn't going to let me retreat. He was standing his ground, demanding an honest answer. I finally met his eyes. People are talking, I said, the words tasting like ash. Mrs. Gable. She said things, a flicker of understanding, followed by a quiet anger, hardened his expression. What people say is of no consequence to me, Leo. Is it to you? My life is small, Julian, I said, the frustration and fear finally bubbling up. I can't afford for it to be fodder for gossip. And we're from different worlds. You have to see that. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. I see a man who is kind and creative and resilient, he said, his voice low and steady, cutting through all my defenses. I see a man I want to know better. The rest is just details. Scenery. He took a small step closer, not crossing the threshold, but shrinking the distance between us until I could feel the warmth of his body. Just so we're clear, he continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a resonant hum that vibrated through my chest. My only intention was to fix a leak. That was a structural problem. Anything else that happened between us, that's separate. It's not an obligation. It's an invitation. And it is entirely up to you whether you accept it. He had done it again. He had laid all the cards on the table. He had seen my fear, my insecurity about our differences, and he had gently, respectfully, handed all the power back to me. He wasn't a predator. He wasn't a wealthy man looking for a dalliance. He was just Julian, a man who saw me, and who was brave enough to ask to be seen in return. My carefully built walls crumbled to dust. I stand there, in the doorway of my life, and he stands on the threshold of his. The choice is mine. Retreat into the familiar quiet, or step into the terrifying, beautiful unknown. The fear is a cold knot in my stomach, but the hope is a fire catching in my chest. I can't let fear win. Not this time. That night, I couldn't sleep. Julian's words echoed in my mind. An invitation. The hallway between our apartments felt like a vast, uncharted territory. For hours, I paced the small confines of my living room, the ghost of his presence lingering in the air. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with a question. I thought about my life, the careful, lonely box I had built for myself. It was safe, yes, but it was also suffocating. Julian's arrival had been like a hammer to the wall, letting in a sliver of light, a breath of fresh air. To ignore it now, to patch it up and pretend it never happened, felt like a betrayal of some nascent, braver version of myself. Around 10 o'clock, I stopped pacing. I stood in the center of the room, my heart hammering a frantic, decisive rhythm against my ribs. I am going to answer him. I am going to walk across that hall. The decision settles over me, a terrifying calm. This is it. This is the moment everything changes. I didn't bother to change my clothes or comb my hair. I wanted him to see me as I was, stripped of pretense. I walked out of my apartment, not bothering to lock the door behind me. The short walk to 3B felt like a mile. I raised my hand and knocked, the sound echoing in the silent hallway. The door opened almost immediately, as if he had been waiting. He was still dressed in the same dark trousers and a simple, dark blue shirt. His hair was slightly disheveled, and he wasn't wearing shoes. He looked surprised to see me, but a quiet, hopeful light sparked in his gray eyes. "Leo," he breathed. My carefully rehearsed speeches evaporated. All I could manage to say was, "Thank you for fixing the pipe." It sounded so stupid, so small. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face, reaching his eyes and making them crinkle at the corners. He leaned against the doorframe, his posture relaxed but his gaze intent. "The pipe was easy," he said, his voice a low, intimate rumble. "The real repair is upstairs. If you're willing," he stepped back, opening the door wider, inviting me in. I crossed the threshold, and the world shifted on its axis. His apartment was nothing like I had imagined. It wasn't a sterile, minimalist palace of wealth. It was a home. Bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, crammed with books of all kinds. The furniture was comfortable, well-made, and looked like it had been lived in. There was a faint scent of old paper, leather, and the same cedar that clung to him. It was a space that was unequivocally his, solid, warm, and intelligent. He closed the door behind me, the soft click shutting out the rest of the world. We stood in the entryway, the air thick with everything we hadn't said. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was full of potential. I finally found my voice, the real one, the one that had been hiding behind layers of fear and insecurity. I began, my voice shaking only slightly. "I've been wanting more than a fixed ceiling." The admission hung in the warm air between us. It was everything. It was the truth. Julian's expression softened completely. All the caution, all the careful distance he had maintained, melted away. He closed the remaining space between us in 2 slow steps. He didn't touch me, not yet. He just looked at me, his eyes searching mine, making sure. "I've been hoping you would," he whispered, the words a soft caress. And then he raised his hand, not to my face, but to my arm, his fingers gently curling around my bicep. The touch was grounding, a question and an answer all at once. It was a steadying weight, a quiet claim. I leaned into it, a silent surrender. He lowered his head, and I lifted mine. The first kiss wasn't a collision of passion. It was a slow, deliberate meeting. It was gentle, unhurried, and deeply tender. His lips were soft, warm, and they tasted faintly of the coffee he must have been drinking. It was a kiss of profound recognition, as if we had been waiting for this moment our entire lives. It wasn't about lust, it was about arrival. It felt right, unforced. A key turning in a lock I hadn't known was there. When we finally broke apart, it was only by inches. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. I could feel his breath on my skin, warm and even. My own breathing was ragged, my heart a wild bird in my chest. He laced the fingers of his free hand with mine, his grip firm and reassuring. We just stood there, in the quiet entryway of his home, breathing together. The relief was a physical thing, a wave that washed over me, carrying away years of loneliness and fear. I had taken the risk. I had stepped out of my safe, small box and into the light. And I had been met with a kindness so steady, so absolute, it felt like coming home. The repair was done, not the one in the wall, but the one in me. I woke to the soft gray light of dawn filtering through the tall windows of Julian's bedroom. For a moment, I was disoriented, the unfamiliar ceiling, the weight of the heavy linen duvet, the sheer size of the room throwing me off balance. Then it all came rushing back, the knock on his door, the confession, the kiss that had felt like a homecoming. I was in Julian's bed, in his home. A flush of heat spread through me, a mixture of giddy joy and a deep, gut-wrenching panic. I turned my head slowly. He was still asleep, lying on his back, one arm flung over his head. In sleep, his face was unguarded, the stern lines of concentration smoothed away. He looked peaceful, younger. The sight of him, so vulnerable and real, made my chest ache with a tenderness that was sharp and new. But the panic was still there, a cold undercurrent beneath the warmth. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, padding on bare feet across a beautiful, antique Persian rug. My clothes were neatly folded on a leather armchair in the corner. As I dressed, I took in the room, the details I hadn't noticed last night. The art on the walls wasn't flashy. It was a collection of architectural drawings and subtle abstract paintings. The books stacked on his nightstand were a mix of classic philosophy and modern poetry. This room, this entire apartment, spoke of a life of substance, of quiet, intellectual depth, of a level of financial freedom I couldn't even begin to comprehend. And I was here, in my worn-out jeans and a t-shirt that had seen better days. The insecurity I thought I had conquered came roaring back. What was I doing here? This was a mistake. I was a tourist in his world, a temporary guest. The imbalance between us, which had seemed like a manageable detail last night, now felt like an insurmountable chasm in the stark light of morning. I found him in the kitchen, a stunning space of dark wood, stainless steel, and marble. He was already dressed, standing by a professional-grade espresso machine, a steaming cup in his hand. He turned as I entered, and a soft smile touched his lips. "Good morning," he said, his voice a low, warm hum. "Morning," I mumbled, hovering awkwardly in the doorway. He seemed so at ease, so perfectly at home in his own skin, while I felt like an imposter, a fraud who had somehow wandered into the wrong life. His smile faded as he took in my posture, the tension in my shoulders, the way I wouldn't quite meet his eye. He was perceptive. I had learned that about him. He saw everything. He set his cup down on the counter and walked toward me, his movements slow and deliberate, as if approaching a frightened animal. "Coffee?" he asked gently. I just nodded, unable to trust my voice. He prepared a cup for me with quiet efficiency, his hand steady. He handed it to me, his fingers brushing mine. The simple touch sent a jolt through me, but it wasn't enough to dispel the cloud of anxiety that had settled over me. We stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the quiet hum of the refrigerator. He was giving me space, waiting for me to speak. But I didn't know what to say. Finally, he broke the silence. "Leo," he began, his voice soft but firm, compelling me to look at him. "Talk to me. What are you thinking?" I took a sip of the coffee. It was rich and dark, the best I'd ever tasted. It felt like another reminder of the gulf between our lives. I gestured vaguely at the beautiful kitchen, at him, at everything. "It's a lot," he nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "I know, I don't belong here," I whispered, the words a painful admission of my deepest fear. He didn't deny it. He didn't offer false platitudes. Instead, he took a step closer, his expression serious. "This," he said, indicating the apartment with a sweep of his hand, "is just a place. It's wood and stone and glass. It's not who I am. It's what I have. There's a difference." He reached out, not to touch me, but just to hover his hand in the space between us. "What happened last night? That was about you and me. Not about this." His eyes were intense, willing me to understand. "This doesn't have to change your life unless you want it to. Your apartment is still your own. Your work is your own. Your independence is your own. I would never take that from you." He let his hand fall to his side. "This," he said, his voice dropping, becoming more intimate, "us, is something we build together. If you want to. On level ground. I promise you that." I stared at him, my throat tight. He understood. He saw my fear of being consumed, of being a project or a charity case, and he was meeting it head on. He was offering me not a rescue, but a partnership. He was giving me back the agency I thought I had lost the moment I stepped into his world. The knot of anxiety in my chest began to loosen. "Okay," I said, the word coming out on a shaky breath. Level ground. A wave of relief washed over his face. He reached out then and gently took my hand, his thumb stroking across my knuckles. It wasn't a possessive gesture. It was a grounding one, a silent reassurance. "Okay," he repeated softly. "Now, how do you take your eggs?" A few days later, the real test came. I was leaving the building when I ran into Mr. Henderson, the building manager. He was a smarmy man with a clipboard and an air of self-importance. He'd always treated me with a kind of benign neglect, the way one treats a tenant who pays rent on time, but is otherwise insignificant. "Morning, Leo," he said, his smile a little too wide. "Everything all settled with that plumbing issue?" "Yes, all fixed. Thanks," I said, trying to move past him. Good, he said, blocking my path. "It pays to make friends in high places, eh? Mr. Vance doesn't usually get involved in the building's little maintenance problems." His eyes glinted with a greasy curiosity. He was fishing, trying to confirm the gossip he'd undoubtedly heard from Mrs. Gable. A week ago, a comment like that would have sent me into a spiral of shame and panic. I would have mumbled an excuse and fled. But standing there, I felt the memory of Julian's hand in mine, the echo of his promise. On level ground, a strange, new confidence settled in my bones. I met his gaze directly, my expression calm. "Julian was just being a good neighbor," I said, my voice even and cool. "The leak was coming from his apartment, so it was his responsibility. He handled it. That's all." I used Julian's first name deliberately. I didn't offer any more information. I stated the facts, shut down the insinuation, and reclaimed the narrative. Henderson was visibly taken aback by my directness. He blinked, his smarmy smile faltering. "Oh, right. Of course. Well, have a good day. He scurried away, his clipboard held like a shield. I walked out into the sunshine, a real, genuine smile on my face. I hadn't shrunk. I hadn't hidden. I had stood my ground. Later that evening, I told Julian about the encounter. We were in my apartment, sitting on my worn-out sofa, a comfortable distance between us. As I recounted the conversation, I saw his jaw tighten, a flicker of cold anger in his eyes. "He had no right to speak to you that way," he said, his voice a low growl. The anger wasn't directed at me. It was for me. It was protective, a quiet fury on my behalf. And it felt good. It didn't feel like he was trying to fight my battles, but like he was standing with me in my corner. We had navigated our first test, and we had done it together, even though we had been apart. The ground beneath my feet felt a little more solid. We didn't fall into a whirlwind romance. That wasn't Julian's style, and it wasn't what I needed. What we built was slower, more deliberate, and infinitely stronger. It was constructed out of small moments, quiet conversations, and a deepening sense of mutual respect. We established a rhythm that felt right for us. Some nights we had dinner at his place, cooking together in his magnificent kitchen. Other nights we ordered cheap pizza and ate it out of the box in my cluttered living room. He never once commented on the difference, never made me feel like my world was lesser than his. He simply met me where I was. One evening, about a month after the leak, we were sitting on his balcony, watching the city lights blink on as dusk settled over the skyline. The view was breathtaking, a panorama of glittering towers and endless streets. It was a view that screamed of power and wealth, a constant reminder of the world he inhabited. "Does this ever feel normal to you?" I asked, gesturing at the city spread out below us. He was quiet for a moment, sipping his wine. "It feels familiar," he said finally, "but not more real than the view from your window. It's just a different angle." He turned to me, his expression serious in the fading light. "Leo, we need to talk about this." About the money. My stomach clenched. I had been dreading this conversation, the moment where the unspoken elephant in the room would finally be addressed. "It's a tool, that's all," he said, as if reading my mind. "It can create comfort. It can solve problems. It can also create imbalances and expectations. I never, ever wanted to be a weight on you or on us. I need you to know that you are not, and will never be, an obligation to me. And I am not a solution to your financial problems." The words were blunt, but they were delivered with such profound kindness, such deep respect for my independence, that they felt like a gift. He was drawing a clear, bright line. Our relationship was one thing. Our financial situations were another. "I would never ask you for anything," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I know," he said softly. "That's one of the things I admire most about you. But I want you to know that if you were ever in real trouble, I would help. Not because I felt obligated, but because I care about you. And I would trust you to let me. Just as I would trust you to help me." If the situation were reversed and all I had was my toolbox, he was creating a partnership of equals, based not on bank accounts, but on mutual care and trust. He was dismantling the power dynamic piece by piece, rebuilding it into something new, something shared. A week later, he came to my door with a small, beautifully wrapped box. Inside was a single key. "It's not a leash," he said, before I could even react. "It's not an expectation. It's an invitation. Come over whenever you want. Or don't. The choice is always, always yours. I just want you to know that the door is always open." I took the key, its metal cool and solid in my palm. It didn't feel like a chain. It felt like an anchor. I closed my hand around it, the serrated edges pressing into my skin. "Thank you," I whispered. I didn't use the key for 3 days. I needed to prove to myself that I could, that the choice was mine. I needed to know that our dynamic hadn't changed. We still met in the hallway, still knocked on each other's doors. On the 4th day, after a long, frustrating day of work, I found myself standing outside his apartment. Instead of knocking, I slid the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, the tumbler clicking open with a satisfying sound. I stepped inside. The apartment was quiet. Julian was in the living room, sitting in his favorite leather armchair, reading a book, a pair of glasses perched on his nose. He looked up as I entered, and his face broke into a slow, brilliant smile. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated welcome. "Hi," he said. "Hi," I replied, a matching smile spreading across my face. I didn't have to explain why I was there. I didn't have to ask permission. I just walked over to the sofa, kicked off my shoes, and curled up on the cushions, pulling a soft throw blanket over me. He went back to his book, and I closed my eyes, listening to the soft rustle of the turning pages and the steady rhythm of his breathing. We sat in comfortable, companionable silence for over an hour. It wasn't exciting. It wasn't dramatic. It was peaceful. It was domestic. It felt, more than anything else had, like I was home. The dripping sound that had started it all was a distant memory. It had been a symptom of a structural problem, a weakness in the bones of the building. But it had led me here, to this quiet room, to this steady man. It had led me to a foundation that felt solid, true, and built to last. I had started with a leak in my ceiling, a constant, maddening reminder of my own precariousness. And I had ended up with a key in my pocket and a man who looked at me as if I were the most precious thing in his world. I opened my eyes and looked at him. He was watching me over the top of his book, his gray eyes soft with an emotion I was finally brave enough to name. It was love, and it was reflected, I knew, in my own gaze. The age difference, the money, the gossip, all of it had faded into the background, becoming what he had called it, just scenery. The reality was here, in this room. It was the quiet trust, the shared peace, the conscious, daily choice to build a life together. On level ground. Share your thoughts in the comments. What moment stayed with you? If the story resonated, a like helps others find it. Subscribe for more slow burn male/male love stories told with warmth and care.